Hi guys, this is Alan. If you listen and like these podcasts, please consider making a small donation to keep the podcasts alive. Unfortunately, at the moment, I have no other means of generating an income, and I really do enjoy making these recordings for you. If you are like me, struggling to make ends meet, and you can't afford to make a small donation, then please simply press like and subscribe and recommend it to a friend. That would be a tremendous help. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. I will put the link below in the description for this podcast. Thank you. Okay, now back to the saga. From the moment I arrived at Casa on March 15th, 2020, Francis and David asked me, and everybody else that turned up, if they wanted to buy the lease. In Spain, this is called traspaso, to transfer the legal documents over to somebody else's name. And when they asked me, they were looking for €7,000 and a minimum stay of 5 years. And much later on, I learnt that David already had an outstanding bill of €5,000 at a shop in Astorga for groceries over the previous few years. After Frank was ordered to leave, life continued as before at La Casa, slipping back into the mundane routines. And with lockdown in other parts of Spain being eased more and more every week, we were in a very strict province, Castilla y León. They were the same police force that came looking for me 3 times about my motorbike crash that I had 30 years ago in Valencia. But then, in mid-May, a young pilgrim cycled into camp. A cross between a hippie and a Camino vagabond, Camino had arrived. Wild in appearance, with an unkempt beard, and feathers and flowers in his hat. Apparently, he'd been staying in a small hippie commune somewhere not far away. He was a Swiss German, and about 27, 28, I would guess. After all the greetings, David immediately asked him if he wanted to take over the lease, and Camino said, OK. The price had gone up, but the 5-year period stayed the same. Camino told me later on that he'd always fancied having a garden, somewhere where he could grow flowers and vegetables, even though he knew very little about gardening and how to grow things. He was a really quiet person, almost shy, but I sensed his brain was working hard underneath his hat. In the shack, he would constantly thumb through a small German-Spanish dictionary, appearing to be searching or learning new words. But I suspect he was just trying to understand the dynamics of us as a group. During my early days at La Casa, I realised that David, Gala and Francis had some very different ideas and very strong opinions about things. They weren't scared to voice their opinion or back them up. They saw a good argument as part of the daily fight. And then with Paco and Carlos too, with their beliefs and their inflated egos. We were a strange group of individuals all living together. And as I said in last week's episode, so strong were their convictions that if the government told everyone they must wear 2 shoes, they would only wear 1. David was always thinking about ways to promote himself. He would get on to the local radio stations talking about our lockdown situation and having all these international pilgrims staying. It happened 3 or 4 times. And on one of the last occasions when he started preaching conspiracy theories, they faded music in and faded him out, which really annoyed him. And then his sister found a Spanish documentary maker looking for a 4th story to complete his film called Destiny. A week later, Manuel showed up to film David and eventually to record his barefoot walk to Santiago, then on to Finisterre. Camino had been with us for about 2 weeks, and he'd been very busy. In that time, He'd already transformed some of the land behind the goat shed, digging and replanting, buying seeds and watering. Then one evening, Camino went to the nearby column and climbed the ladder to the top to watch the sun set. He'd been up there about 45 minutes when I saw someone else at the bottom, and it looked very much like a real pilgrim, who waited for Camino to come down. Then together they strolled the 200 metres back to the shack. And the newcomer was a pilgrim from the Netherlands. Jordi was his name, and he was with Lucy. Apparently Lucy was from the Pyrenean region somewhere, and was his very close partner on the Camino. As he was introduced to David, Jordi explained that another pilgrim who passed by the Casa de los Dioses some time earlier asked Jordi to call in if he was passing and to say hello and give his regards to David. But the big surprise was to find out that Jordi had already met Camino before, a couple of years before, and I think he said it was in Santiago when Jordi finished walking the Camino for the very first time. And after Jordi was introduced to everybody, he pitched his low bivvy tent out the back in the long grass between the reservoirs, while David heated water so he could have a shower in the goat shed. Oh, by the way, Lucy turned out to be a real bitch, of the dog variety, a cute little white thing Jordi had rescued after it had been abandoned somewhere along the way. And everybody made a fuss of her at some time, but strangely enough, by Paco more than anyone. Paco is still saying every day that he's leaving tomorrow, because everything's shit. And you know that he's always been super pessimistic. One day he volunteered to peel potatoes, so Tao could make some chips. He said it was something he did a lot of in prison. Carlos called his friend the priest twice more, and 2 more boxes of food and tobacco turned up, about 2 weeks apart, delivered by the same curate. David took charge of the deliveries both times and distributed the tobacco out, annoying Carlos, but he said nothing. But none of us knew or realized that all this was building up inside Carlos, like a volcano waiting to erupt. One morning, Jordi and I walked to the supermarket in Astorga, and after buying what we needed, we went across the road to the park and made ourselves sandwiches for lunch, which was strangely exotic compared to the food we'd had over the last 2 months or so. And at that time, the lockdown law was that only one parent and their children were allowed out, making us stick out a bit amongst the mothers and small children there, a bit like a couple of red roses in a cornfield. And at this point, I'd just like to apologise publicly to Jordi for causing a deep cut in his hand. It was my fault, I take full responsibility, and I should have known better, because I distracted him while he was sharpening his own machete. Thankfully, Gala patched him up quickly and bandaged his hand. Jordi and Lucy stayed for about 2 weeks before they slipped back onto the Camino once again and headed west towards Santiago. The lockdown was still in force and all the borders closed between all the provinces. And as all the albergues were either closed or up for sale, Jordi planned to stealth camp his way along the Camino. Manuel was still following David around, even when he went into the village or into Astorga. And at night he'd sleep in his car behind the goat shed. He left for a few days and returned with 2 or 3 old mobile phones he'd scavenged up for Tao and Carlos. It was David's suggestion, but arguments broke out as Carlos came off worse with an old Nokia, which really pissed him off. It just added more fuel to the fire inside Carlos. The pressure was building up, waiting to explode. Now the lease had been finalised, David paid off his enormous outstanding bill at the grocer's shop in Astorga and had a little bit of money left in his pocket. Now, for some reason, which still eludes me, both Carlos and Paco asked David for some money. Personally, I was a little shocked, a little disappointed in humanity at that moment. If anything, it should have been the other way around. It riled David too. I saw it in his face. Then, after complaining for 2 months, Paco once again said he was leaving tomorrow. We laughed. None of us believed him. But after packing his bike the following afternoon, he cycled up to the main road and vanished. By that time, they had extended the exercise period from lockdown, when people could go out of their houses from something like 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 in the evening every day. Now groups of cyclists and joggers enjoyed the countryside again. And as whole families strolled along the Camino and past La Casa, David climbed up onto the goat shed roof, took all his clothes off and lay in full view of the Camino and to all who came past. And he said he was sunbathing. If there are children with their families and they see that, that's not good. And if he wants to sunbathe naked, he could do that easily out the back where nobody would see him. Eventually, David gave in to Carlos's demands and gave him some money, and maybe Tao too, but none of us knew that at the time. So when I heard that Carlos and Tao had cycled off down to the petrol station around mid-morning the next day, I just assumed they'd gone down there to charge up their second-hand phones. And I carried on with my day, unaware of what was going to kick off later that evening. At around 9 o'clock, Gala wandered back to camp, saying that Carlos and Tao were down at the petrol station, absolutely drunk. They were sitting at an outside table that was littered with empty beer cans, and Carlos got into an argument with some local guys at another table. He'd been shouting his mouth off again, and the local guys started winding him up, laughing at him, provoking him, as the Spanish do. They criticised his woodwork and said that he wasn't really allowed to work in Spain as he was Portuguese. But Carlos didn't see the funny side of it. And in fact, he always got aggressive and defensive when anybody criticised his work, even when he wasn't drunk. And to him it was like a red rag to a bull. Now his ego and pride had been dented, and Carlos started to fight. All this happened just around about 10 o'clock at night. Both Carlos and Tao were completely drunk, having been drinking for 11 hours. By now, the cashier in the petrol station had had enough and told them over the forecourt PA system that he was calling the police. Instantly they panicked and ran around like headless chickens for a few seconds before jumping on their bikes and wobbling and weaving across the forecourt in an attempt to get away. Tao made it out onto the main road, but Carlos crashed straight into a 4x4 coming into the petrol station. Apparently, he went over the bonnet from one side to the other without touching it, splitting his head open as he head-butted the concrete on the other side. Belligerently, Carlos got up and tried to escape again for the second time before the police arrived, but the driver dissuaded him and gave him a lift back to La Casa via the Camino trail, the shortest route back. And the first thing any of us knew about it, back at camp, was when a dark blue 4x4 pulled up at the shack and Carlos got out, blood all over his face from a deep cut over his left eye. David thanked the driver and he drove away. Looking like a prize fighter who had lost the fight, we all tried to help him but he wasn't interested in his injury. And Carlos wouldn't stop talking about how he was defending his honour down at the petrol station. I'd seen and heard enough, and I went back to my tent, and so did Gala. Tao was nowhere to be seen. Even an hour later he hadn't arrived back at camp, and I hoped he was just hiding out in the woods somewhere. My tent looked out towards the Camino, and from there I could hear all the conversations and clearly see the area around the shack. Carlos wouldn't stop talking, and David kept telling him to shut up several times, and that provoked him even more, instantly shouting louder at David, telling him that it was him who should have received the food parcels from his friend, the priest. It was because of me he was my friend, I heard Carlos say. And with raised voices the two argued into the night. I could hear Carlos's anger stretched to the limit in his voice. And then it snapped, and he punched David hard in the shoulder, trying to get him to fight back. But David held him off at arm's length, saying he didn't want to fight him. But Carlos kept coming at him, and I heard David screaming repeatedly, "Stop it, stop it, stop it," until David had trouble defending himself. But Carlos wouldn't stop pushing, and David had to start fighting back just to keep Carlos off him. And David reluctantly hit him and put him on the floor, then sat on him astride to try and diffuse his anger. But it just seemed to make Carlos even more angry, stronger. Then David jumped up and disappeared off into the night and into the woods. By now it was well after midnight, and Carlos started calling out for David to come back and fight. He was walking up and down the Camino by the shack, shouting out to David to come back and fight. Then, slowly realizing he wasn't coming back, he looked around for a new target. Still pumped up and no one to fight. Carlos stared at my tent for a few seconds, then charged around the back towards the goat shed where Gala and Camino were sleeping. Now I hear you say, "Why didn't you get involved? Why didn't you break it up?" One thing travelling has taught me, and it was a long time ago, is not to get involved in other people's fights. And especially in Asia, just trying to stop a fight, you can end up in jail. With David off in the woods somewhere and Carlos around in the goat shed, my fear was the safety of Gala and Camino. So I stepped out into the night. It was unbelievably quiet now. But then I heard David's voice. It was a long way off. He was talking to someone, but by the sounds of it, he was talking on his phone. He sounded about 200-300 metres away, maybe up on the road that goes to the recycling plant. Then I heard a vehicle coming and saw some headlights coming up the Camino from the valley, from the direction of the petrol station. And I laughed when I saw who it was. It was the Guardia Civil, 4 of them. And later that night, I was surprised to find out that it wasn't David who called them. He was talking to his sister. David saw the car and ran back to meet the police, and I went round the back to the goat shed. Seeing Gala first, she nodded to say she was okay but scared. And then I looked around the corner of the wall to my right, and I saw Carlos sitting beside Camino's bed, talking to him. He didn't seem to have any type of weapon in his hands, but he still had that wild, crazy, wide-eyed look on his face. His hair was a mess, and with the dried blood, he looked like a scared animal trapped in a corner. I said as softly as possible, so not to provoke him further, "Carlos, the police are here," hoping that this would get him to run off or at least come out of the goat shed, as a policeman appeared around the building from the other side with his torch. So I went back around the front. But amazingly, the police hadn't come for Carlos at all. they'd come about Tao, who was sitting in a jail in Leon, 50 kilometres away. But more about that later. And at this point, Carlos came storming back around the front to confront the police, swinging his arms drunkenly, punching the air, wanting to fight all four of the burly police officers, assuming as I did that they'd come for him. As Carlos rushed up, the biggest policeman and the boss said to Carlos, calm down, we haven't come for you, so be good and just calm down." Well, Carlos was just blown away. He was stunned and shocked, rooted to the spot. He just stood there for a second or two, wondering if he'd heard correctly, as the policeman turned and spoke with David. Then Carlos got annoyed and angry that they hadn't come for him. He started getting belligerent and argumentative again. The same policeman turned back and with a firmer voice said, "Look, don't give us any trouble. We don't want to have to come back here and arrest you too." And by now, Camino and Gala had come to see what was happening, and David confirmed to the Guardia Civil that Tao was in lockdown at la Casa de los Dioses. They had a chat to one side, away from us. Then they got in their car and disappeared back into the night. I saw the look of total disappointment on David's face as he tried to understand why Tao would do such a thing. Deflated, Carlos was mumbling to Camino, asking drunken questions, as his anger turned to drunken sadness and self-pity, and he started feeling sorry for himself. Camino agreed with everything he asked for, and that seemed to please Carlos. Gala had slipped away into her tent in the goat shed, and unseen I quietly went back to mine. David was sitting deep in thought in the shack. Then Camino told Carlos he was going back to sleep, and Carlos mooched off into the shack and sat by the fire. David was visibly upset about Tao's actions. Now it was around 2 a.m, maybe 2:30, something like that, and there'd been enough trouble for one night. But the night wasn't over yet. Back in the tent, I heard David angrily ask Carlos why he got Tao drunk. Now, I'll tell you what the police said and what happened to Tao. As you remember, they panicked, jumped on their bikes, and in their escape, Carlos didn't get very far. Tao, totally drunk, was having problems staying on his bike. He wobbled off into the darkness along the main road without any lights. And apparently he was still trying to drink the beer from the can as he attempted to ride back. And when he came to a long right-hand curve in the road, he cut the corner and was on the wrong side of the road when a car with a young family in it came around the corner, the police said. The car had to swerve to miss Tao, who they didn't see because he didn't have any lights. And apparently that's when Tao threw the empty can at the car's windscreen. The occupants of the car called the police, who tracked Tao down and arrested him. The police said that he was very uncooperative and he could be charged with resisting arrest as well as being drunk in charge of a bike without any lights on a public road. He was now sitting in a jail 50 kilometres away in Leon, and boy, is he going to have a headache tomorrow. Okay, back to the shack. Carlos and David were arguing worse than before, shouting wildly at each other. Carlos was still pumped up and looking for a fight, but when he staggered out to urinate against the wall, David quietly slipped away and ran for the hills. Well, back into the woods, which left Carlos standing on his own, still angry, wide-eyed and swaying. He started shouting for David to come back again, and finally he gave up. And now, looking round for something else to embed his wrath, he focused his fury onto my tent and me inside it. And from the middle of the garden, he stood swaying and shouting as loud as he could. Alan, Dioses un puta mierda inglés. Alan, Dioses una puta mierda inglés. Over and over again, trying to provoke me, wanting me to react. And it occurred to me early on that if he found the machete or got the axe and started slicing up the tent, then I would react, because it's not my tent. My biggest concern was if I had to get out my torch, and this was no ordinary torch. It came with a warning on how to defend yourself. Once upon a time I relished a good fight, but those days were long over. My strength was in my patience and my ability to suck it up. He'd moved closer to my tent and he screamed even louder, similar insults in Spanish, possibly just in case I was asleep. If he used a machete or an axe, I would confront him with my eye-melting torch. I had decided that that would be my limit of patience. He aimed his verbal abuse at me for over an hour, until it was well past 4 a.m. in the morning. And over time, Carlos slowly drifted nearer his sleeping area at the end of the lean-to. He was between his area and my tent, still screaming insults at me, but now with less force, less venom. And unknown to me, he was packing his bike while hurling abuse at me. And by about 4:40, 4:45, he pushed his loaded bike across the gravel through the garden, still shouting insults at me, and out onto the Camino. He hesitated momentarily, looking over towards my tent for a few seconds. Then he pushed his bike west into the darkness towards Astorga. I went out and I watched him walk away along the Camino, then across the small tarmac road, and then he was gone. And then I heard David's voice behind me. He was peering around the corner of the goat shed, saying, "Has he gone? Has he gone? Has he gone yet?" "Yeah, I think so," I said.
Until next week,